Okay, great. Well, let's get going. So welcome to virtual smart salon on bringing together qualitative and quantitative research. So we're kind of looking at how we can take the kind of breadth of quantitative research and integrate some of the depth of qualitative research in different applications. I'm Richard Whitehall, a partner and executive director at Smart Design, where work across a lot of industries, but kind of really helping integrate design and research very, very tightly. And Leah Cabrera Fisher is an associate strategy director here. We work closely together on a lot of interesting international research programs, pulling together data and human insight. So very excited to welcome everybody to the Salon. Just a bit of context on this series. So Virtual Smart Salons is an event series that we've actually been running smart salons for the last 15 years. But this sort of current series is virtual, and it was kind of based around a research study that we did at the beginning of the year, talking to a lot of our clients and people from Smart, understanding what are some of the trends and interesting topics in design research today. And then over the course of 5 different events, we've been exploring different themes that came out of that study. The one we did last month was about engaging the organization. So what are the different kind of ways that we can engage organizations in design research, both in the activities and output? Some really interesting insights from people looking at insights databases, different methods of storytelling. So that was a really cool event. Today, I already mentioned the topic, and just for a bit of context, the ones coming up in the future, we'll be talking in December about ethics in design research, which is a really interesting topic. The 4th one will be about using creative methods in kind of research and how we go beyond what people say. And then the 5th one is how do we think about the future and sort of creating really human-centered design methods, but also leaning into what's going to happen sort of in a few years' time. So that's the overview of the series. Today, just to tee up the topic overall, as researchers, we have really a whole series of different technology platforms at our service these days. So it's easier and easier to kind of gather data, both behavioral data from products, but also sort of running quick surveys and even publicly available kind of data. So we have these kind of amazing sources available to us, as well as some of the more traditional qualitative methods. However, the kind of, how do we kind of mesh up the kind of depth of in-person observational insights with some of the broader sort of data insights? So how do you bring those two things together in a way that adds up to more than the sum of the parts? So the big question is really, how can design and product teams effectively combine the depth of qualitative with the breadth of quantitative? How do these two things come together to create increased value? Our panelists. So first of all, welcome to the panelists. It was really interesting trying to bring together a panel that combined just a ton of amazing experience and expertise, but I think also sort of different experiences from different industries. So we have somebody who's more from the tech industry, where data is very available. Somebody from a non-profit that's more thinking about sort of gathering that kind of data in the field, which again is a very different kind of process. And then somebody from media publication, where again the audience and the type of content is a little bit different. So I'll just introduce everybody one by one. So first of all, welcome to Ashley, who's a user researcher at Spotify, where she kind of focuses on really bringing together user research to different business teams and really understanding how they can kind of grow Spotify's business to meet the needs of people when they're working and at play. So welcome, Ashley. Secondly, Rachel, who's the Associate Director of Design and Innovation at the Airbell Impact Lab, which is part of the International Rescue Committee, where they're doing sort of amazing multidisciplinary work, which is focused on designing and testing life-changing scalable solutions for people affected by conflict and disaster. And then Juliet, who formerly worked at IDEO, but is now the Managing Director of User Insight and Strategy for New York Times Cooking. So, you know, we've all been looking at the New York Times over the last few weeks at the election results, all the amazing use of kind of data, as well as amazing kind of stories. Juliet applies this within cooking, which is very close to a lot of the work that Smart Design does in the food sort of industry. So very interesting area. And she is really kind of leading the kind of research and strategy efforts there. So we're going to start off just by getting each of the panelists just to talk about an example of where they've brought qualitative research and quantitative research together to create impact, really adding those kind of two pieces together. And we'll just go across in order. So I'll ask Ashley first of all just to say hi and kind of talk about her example.
Hello, everyone. Really excited to be here and to just really dive into these topics and learn from the other panelists. So my example is the customer journey framework that I developed through a research-based approach at IBM. And it's probably like my favorite piece of work that I did there. And it really was a piece of work that helped us to understand our relationships with customers over time. So in a huge enterprise like IBM, you've got hundreds of products, maybe thousands of teams. How do we start to understand our relationships with customers holistically? So this framework really brought together the qualitative understanding from all those various teams, gave them a framework to really bring and seeing that picture together. And then we'd also layered in various KPIs and metrics that helped us to understand what was happening across that relationship, both behaviorally and in terms of the business impact. So it was a really fun piece of work to bring the organization together. It, of course, had a lot of breadth in terms of what it applied to, implications for employees as well as our users. And it really got to the depth of understanding the relationship with us in order for us to improve that over time.
Great, thank you, Ashley. So we'll go to Rachel next.
Hi, everyone. So this is a photo of a community health officer named Kenneth Mwenda, who's on a design sprint team that was around reducing maternal mortality in camp in Kenya. The sprint was initiated because we looked across data to assess vulnerabilities that existed among some of our populations. And what we found was that prior to COVID, maternal mortality was incredibly low in the camp. But after COVID started sort of progressing through the camp, even our short design sprint, there were 3 maternal deaths. And so this became something where looking at the data, assessing the risks and vulnerabilities allowed us to understand that this kind of qualitative, what he's doing here is prototype testing, a sort of tracking app that we created. It allowed us to understand the need for more traditional design research methods. So it was a good combination of looking at sort of large scale data, having actual experience with some of those risks happening during the sprint, and then also using design research to follow on.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. And then we'll go to Juliet.
Hi, so many of you might be familiar with NYT Cooking, but if you're not, it's an app and website from the New York Times that helps people cook. So recipes, instructional content, that kind of thing. And it kind of sits alone as a product. It's actually part of a group called the Standalone Products Group. And so we often do think about the needs and behaviors of the people using cooking in particular, as potentially separate from the people who are using, NY Times proper. So, one thing that we've done with qualitative and quantitative approaches is understanding our audience for cooking. So in order to understand a target audience, meaning who are we designing for, what do they need, and how many of those people are there, you really do need both approaches. And how we've done this is really starting a couple of years ago, we first did a lot of qualitative work to understand what do people need when it comes to a cooking source, right? What are they looking for? What are they making decisions about, deciding what to trust, who to trust for cooking, small c cooking. We used what we learned there to design a survey instrument that we felt was comprehensive. And that survey was distributed to a census representative panel of people from across the US. So really large scale survey. And the analysis of that survey, we did a combination of cluster analysis and factor analysis to get at what are the patterns that are emerging around what people are wanting and needing and doing. And 6 clusters emerged from that process. And we chose 2 of those to be our target clusters, and essentially then our target segments. So those are the folks then that we decided that we would focus on designing for and building for. A lot of stuff came up very quickly from that work that we wanted to act on very immediately. One thing was around Android usage, realizing how much of our potential audience was on Android, and we're like, we need to go build an Android app, right? So that was very obvious, but there are many kind of finer points around what people are needing and doing that we wanted to help our product and editorial teams get. So coming out of the survey, we developed what's called a typing tool, which allows you to essentially like a little magazine quiz, answer some questions around motivations and behaviors and attitudes around cooking, and that tells you what cluster you fall out into. So when we do research recruiting for qual research, we're able to put potential qual participants through this battery and be able to understand what segment they fall out into. So we do that for all of our studies now. We know what segment they're in. And what you're seeing here is this little snippet of a kind of behavior map across weekends and weekdays for both of our target segments and what people are needing in those moments. So here, these insights came from both qualitative and quantitative research, and it doesn't matter at this point, right? I mean, this is just about really getting to the needs of our audience, and by mapping them out in a way that our product and editorial teams can feel inspired. So, the end result of this, it doesn't matter where these insights come from. We just use whatever method is the most appropriate to get there.
Great, thank you, Juliet. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see everybody's faces a bit better. And I just wanted to encourage everybody in the audience just to add questions in the Q&A chat. And then in between different sections of questions, I will bring in a few questions for the panel. So that's the more qualitative part. And then we do have a quantitative part. So Leah is going to just post a poll. So if everyone in the audience could kind of take a pass at it. The question is really, what is or are the biggest challenges you face in integrating qual and quant research? And we have a few options for you there. So I think we'll kind of run that now. So if everybody fills it out, then after we've done the first round of questions, we'll come back and take a look at it. So at this point, I'll hand it over to Leah, who's gonna run all the questions.
Awesome, thank you, Richard, and thank you all for that introduction. Juliet, we wanted to start with you. So the New York Times has almost 4 million subscribers to the news, and we know that that's a huge audience. And you walked us a little bit about how you've used qual and quant, but we'd love to get your perspective on how you define qualitative and quantitative research, and maybe a bit of insight on what are the strengths and weaknesses of both methodologies.
Yeah, well, to start with, I mean, if you're looking at a business context versus an academic context, there are sometimes different definitions of what constitute qual and quant, and you can get like very fine-grained with how you define them. But for us, it's fairly straightforward, right? We use qual when we're speaking about a small sample size, and we really want to get to a depth of understanding. These are often one-on-one conversations, or they're groups, and it's around nuance, motivations, emerging trends, that kind of thing. And we usually use an unstructured interview format. So researchers are very familiar with this, right? It's what we do. So, at the most basic level, this is about helping teams feel like they know their users. you know, and there's a sense of connectedness with who it is that they're designing for. Insights aside, right? I mean, there's something that feels really good about that for our teams. And by using a semi-structured approach, we're able to let unexpected things bubble in, right? I mean, that's where we get insights around new like emergent behaviors or trends that we might not be able to pick up on in quantitative research. So at the Times, quant research is really in two buckets. One is survey research and the other is behavioral analytics. And behavioral analytics can include, you know, traffic analysis and, you know, anything around retention or conversion, all of that sort of fits into that bucket. A lot of times that's also around something like A/B testing, where we are refining an approach or a concept. So, you know, quant allows for some confidence around trends, right? You can know this many people believe this thing or this many people do this thing, and that's often helpful in an organizational context to explain why something is important. But you know, of course, like you're analyzing behavior, that means you're looking at only things that have been done and only things that have been done in the past. So you're not really getting to people's, you know, needs or motivations or things that they might be doing in the future. And so those are, of course, some drawbacks to that.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Juliet. Ashley, for you, you were looking at an even bigger audience, right? And working in almost like all countries around the world, different languages. So from your perspective, I don't know if there's anything that you'd like to add to how Juliet described qual and quant, but also in thinking of when is it more helpful to use qual versus quant and vice versa?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, well, I work in the advertising side, so our numbers are still large, but not even as large as, right, the consumer side, which is hundreds of millions of people, which is super fascinating. I think one of the things that I enjoy about insights at Spotify is that scale and really being able to see how trends in the world affect our business, affect our user experience. And so in terms of quantitative research, it's really about like seeing how big that trend is, you know, where is that trend showing up? Really having that concrete evidence that we can have confidence in to make business decisions. Whereas a qualitative research, right, it helps us understand, as Juliet said, helps us empathize with our listeners, empathize with our advertisers, really understand their experience and needs holistically. And then also to really guide the direction that we're taking with the user experience or our product. I think one of the drawbacks though of quantitative research is that you're often limited to what you have. So even though at Spotify we have a ton of data, we don't know what, you know, is behaviorally happening on other platforms that are our key competitors or that are analogous experiences that we can understand. So qualitative really helps us understand the whole of the person or the segment or people that we're studying, and to really tie together both what we understand from our data, but also, you know, what's happening in the rest of their lives.
Awesome, thank you. And so we're speaking a little bit about using digital platforms, but Rachel, your experience is a little bit different. Often the audience that you're engaging with might not be using digital platforms, right? And how does this change how you think about qualitative and quantitative research, if at all?
Yeah, it's certainly a challenge. We have nothing like behavioral analytics. Largely the quantitative work that we do, the data that we use and that we seek to collect is targeted towards four main things. One is dispelling. So there was a huge myth in the humanitarian sector that you couldn't give people cash because they would spend it on cigarettes and tobacco, what was called temptation goods. And so we actually at the IRC ran one of the first randomized control trials to prove that actually giving cash resulted in people spending it on things like food and other necessary household items. So we want to, you know, we use data and create surveys, quantitative surveys, to dispel myths. The second thing we do is prove the effectiveness of programs. So while qualitative be used, as Juliet and Ashley have mentioned, to inspire, we develop programs with that kind of research, and then we are held to then use techniques like, or methods like a randomized control trial to actually prove that those different programs do what we thought they would do, right? What we assumed they would do. And then the next thing we do is we use data to, as I mentioned previously, to assess risk and vulnerability. So is there a need for more programs? What is happening within the community? And those are done, in some cases that's a program like something called protection monitoring, and that's wide scale systematic sort of surveying. And this is, to be really concrete about it, it's sometimes going door to door and asking people an hour's worth of questions, but this is to surface human rights abuses. Will then one, sort of lead to caseworkers, and two, go to big stakeholders who then can redistribute money to support those needs. So I think we use we really try to use the right kind of data, but change the method of how we collect that data to match what is available for the need to be in touch with.
Thank you. So the question that we asked our audience was, what are some of the challenges that they have in bringing together qualitative and quantitative research? We're still waiting to get some of the results, but in the meantime, Rachel, I was wondering if you could kick off the next set of questions with, what are some of the challenges that you've seen in bringing together these two sets of methodologies?
Yeah, it's this is, I find that people's openness to doing new methods is frequently well matched to the amount of need that they see for trying new things. So in our field, the IRC has been doing randomized control trials, gold standard of scientific evidence. When we put out a new vaccine, well, hopefully when we put out a new vaccine, this will have gone through very rigorous testing. We do the same thing with our programs, right? This is obviously not in a lab or in a hospital, but in a field. And what we did is we measured those programs, and we saw that impact was actually not what we expected. And that forces you to then reflect on your process and how you're gathering information and the kind of thing. And so there was an openness within our sector and our field to say, how do we need to learn more? What other tools can, and that really created an openness, not just to quality, which academics use incredibly well, but it created an openness to design research and to doing things like Juliet was mentioning, these semi-structured issues, the ability to sort of follow threads of opportunity without sort of stating what you thought you would see in advance. So it was really, it hasn't been a struggle for me, in this current role, but I think it was, the precursor was years of many struggle, of realizing that what we were doing wasn't quite working and we needed new methods.
I'll ask the same question to you, Ashley and Juliet. Maybe Juliet, you want to get us started, but just any challenges that you've seen or that you've experienced in integrating qual and quant?
Yeah, I think first just to say that there aren't that many challenges, and I think that's happened over the years as we've gotten kind of smarter about both approaches. And also, sorry, there's a lot of sirens happening. I don't know what's going on outside. We have a really unique insights group at the Times, which includes essentially both market research and user research functions. And along with those, the skills and methodologies that go along with both. And so we're just kind of inherently equipped to be able to work with those different scales. And I think, being an organization, full of journalists too, like journalists get both data and reporting on the ground, and they understand both of those things. So, so it's not it's not that hard. You know, I think that it's all about, like anything else, communication and standards and understanding other people's needs and working together.
Great. So maybe Ashley, reframing the question a little bit for you, maybe you can walk us through some of the challenges that you've seen, but maybe you can walk us through any tools, frameworks, or any types of collaborations that you've used to successfully work with quantitative researchers or data scientists to integrate findings from both qual and quant.
Yeah, I would agree with the other panelists that it's all about how you're set up. And I think, you know, in terms of organizational, like organizational change or how your insights practice is set up really has an impact on whether you're able to work across quantitative and qualitative research, work across user research or design research and data science. So in my, you know, current role, we're all lined up right to the same leadership. We have common goals, and so we're more incentivized to work together. I've also worked in contexts where, you know, analytics is this far off team of people in another country. They don't have the same goals. And so I think, you know, in terms of being on the same team, having shared goals, that really has an impact on whether you're able to successfully work together.
Any tools, Rachel or Juliet, that you guys use to collaborate with other researchers, specifically like quantitative researchers?
I would just add, just like the research plan is a great collaboration tool, right? Like having the same research questions that you're trying to answer and really teasing out like which methods are going to answer those questions from both quantitative and qualitative research. That would be my super basic answer.
Yeah, I mean, we use lots of very sort of traditional NGO tools like creating a theory of change. So we are really rigorously tracking what we think an outcome will be, and then figure out the ways that we will actually seek to understand that. Now, based on sort of what part of the process you're in, whether it's sort of early stage design research or piloting with a few hundred people or a randomized control trial with a few thousand people, you get to bring in qualitative research in a different way. But yeah, I mean, it's really sort of like unsexy stuff. We create these different sort of maps of the outcomes and the sub-outcomes we think we're gonna see, line those up to sort of the design components that we think will produce those, use an enormous, like always create research and testing plans, different sort of blueprints of when we think we can answer different things. Google Docs is the thing I use the most. But yeah, and this is probably a big sort of comment on where I see my role and expertise ending and like quantitative and academic researchers beginning is I don't know their statistical tools. I don't use those. Our collaboration sort of, you know, I see sort of a clear definition for not my piece of it. We'll just communicate on the goal and what we think will be happening, and then you will go and program that piece of it.
Juliet, do you have anything to add there?
No, I think what Ashley was saying about just starting by thinking about both, like I always, whenever I work with stakeholders to design a research plan, the method is always the very, very last question, you know, and I have a process of steps that I go through just to make sure that we're all on the same page. And first I want to understand, what do you currently believe? Like, what are your current hypotheses? What does success look like? Who are the stakeholders, right? What are the things you really want to know? Who do you want to know those from? And then we get to method, right? And so I think that's a really important piece of it, is just to not like assume. And when someone comes to me and says, we want to do a survey about that, I'm like, wait a second, right? I don't ever let conversations start with a method, because that sometimes is not that helpful.
Awesome. That dovetails one of the things that we've been discussing. It's like, we hear that more and more design researchers are integrating data into how they think about their research. We want to make our results more robust. We want to increase the confidence in our results, right? But we've been questioning, like, has there been too much of a shift towards data-driven research? And if it has been, how do we make the case for for qualitative research? Like, what happens when people don't believe in qualitative research? Juliet, I'll have you start us with that question.
Yeah, there's bath time happening over here, so you'll hear some some 3-year-olds splashing. Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries. We were just saying that, so we've seen a shift, like researchers want to use more and more data. We want to increase the confidence in our results. But has there been too much of a shift towards data-driven research? And how do we make the case for qualitative research when people don't believe in it?
You know, it's funny because I've been doing this either as my full job or as part of my job for like 20 years. And we've been having that conversation the whole time. And so like that hasn't changed. And I feel like it's all about bringing people along the journey. And I mean, look, I like sat in a New York Times subscriber's house in Toronto with, you know, someone who's like a managing editor of the paper, right? Like talking to someone about their lives and what they want and what they do. And like he believes in qual research now, right? So I think that in some ways it's about bringing people into the process and then they start to believe it. But I think when I've seen researchers come in with a sort of defensive posture, which is like not a good look. I think that we should just assume that what we do matters and has value versus assuming that people aren't going to take it seriously. And I see some gendered stuff happening there sometimes too, which I hate to say. Like, I think that we can believe in what we do because we can show value in it, you know. And I think if we come at this with that approach versus trying to explain why we matter, I've just seen that work a little bit better.
Rachel, what are your thoughts on this? And if you could expand, I know that at times we've spoken about the different mindsets and about in qualitative and quantitative. So if you could sprinkle some of that in there.
Yeah, just reflecting on like, and I think this is an issue with data also, is how can you demonstrate the value of it in a really quick and efficient way? And sometimes it's bringing a high-level person into the interview. But the photo I showed earlier was this amazing colleague of mine, Kenneth Mwenda, who has been running this sort of our community health program in this camp for many years. And being able to show him the power of prototype testing, where it was like, here's an idea you have, let's make that idea, and then you show it to people and watch how much better it gets. Like watch how fast it gets much better. And the power of that, not just for him, but for his whole team, was sort of transformational just in terms of the buy-in and the energy that was behind the whole sort of project. So yes, I think that's a huge piece of it, especially in as large an organization as ours, where change takes a long time and operationally requires an enormous amount of stakeholders and consensus. And so I think the mindset is like, let's talk about it a lot. Let's get everyone to agree. And then we can hire someone to sort of make it and we'll see what happens. But generally in our organization, like, we try to talk about qual research as being something that's very generative, right? It's deep, it's generative, it allows you to explore. And that always hasn't been a thing that's been highly prioritized, right? Because the organization has been so evidence-based and so data-driven. And so it really is a thing where it's like, it's not just about being right, it's about being open and inspired. But as sort of Juliet mentioned, I think there's when people have that opportunity, it's not a hard thing for when you see those sort of explosive feelings that sort of come with that and eagerness. It's pretty magical.
Great. Ashley, we'd love also to hear from you before we move to the questions from the audience.
Sure. I feel like these two ladies covered it so well, but I think like Juliet said, there's nothing like putting a prototype in front of a user, having the whole team join, and like watching someone struggle to use the thing. There's nothing like it to compel stakeholders to align to a certain point of view or and to drive impact. I think in addition to that, like sometimes we can't get behavioral data quickly, right? It takes a lot of time to implement it and to create pipelines and like to even have the data available. And so qualitative research or field research really helps us like learn quickly, pivot. Like I as a researcher can follow a thread, I think as Rachel said, and really get to those nuggets in a way that quantitative research maybe isn't as set up to do in a quick fashion.
Great. Awesome. Thank you for that. Richard, I'll hand it over.
Yeah, great. I have a few good questions from the audience. I think we touched a little bit on, I think Rachel touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious to pose it to the whole panel. So the first question is, how do you anticipate solutions for the future when the qualitative and I guess quantitative data relies on current and past experiences? So this is actually the topic of our last panel, but I'd be really curious to hear this kind of panel's thoughts on that. Maybe I'll go to Ashley.
Sure, I'll jump in. I think from my experience, some of the most powerful methods for the future are speculative methods, right? Like projecting ourselves into the future, really creating probes and coming to people with probes and seeing how they respond. But you know, I think none of us can tell the future, but we can only speculate and generate insights that help us get a little bit closer.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else on the panel have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there, as I mentioned before, there's you can look at behavioral data that I think can predict what kind of risks or things you should solve for in the future. So for example, with COVID, it was a pretty obvious one. It's like, oh, people, and this is all over the world, people aren't going to their primary care appointments. All these things that we have set up that prevent these various possible risks are not being adhered to. So we'll need to now deal with the end result of that. I think the second thing, particularly in our context, that's really interesting and is always a big challenge for us is we're working in such low resource contexts. So no cell phones, very different usage of mobile phones, for example, shared mobile phones. How do you then take an idea that might work somewhere else? Or think about what the future of that context is by looking at places that might have more resources. So we do a lot of looking at how we adapt or recontextualize or contextualize work that is in places that might exhibit some of the characteristics of what the sort of different levels of access or different behaviors or different resources might be in other contexts, but what would that look like in ours?
Okay. So the kind of next question, I think this is quite a hard one, but I'm going to throw it at you anyway. So what type of questions are the most successful in obtaining insights? Do you have any thoughts on that? That's quite open-ended, I know.
Okay, generally like showing people something and not talking.
Yeah. I
would say, and frankly, like this is something I've always been terrible about, but it's usually taking yourself out of the room, putting something in front of someone and watching where and this is sort of what Ashley said, like watching where the fumbling or mistakes happen. But leaving that space for people to genuinely experience something. Mm-hmm. The alternative to this is if you don't have a prototype to put in someone, tell people what you're generally curious about at a pretty high altitude and see what they start talking about. So this is something we explore a lot, and when we do a lot of, as one might imagine with COVID, we do a lot more work where we're not doing the research directly, but we rather work with teams on the ground who are much closer to those who we seek to impact. And so we think a lot about what kind of guidance or protocols or questionnaires we work on with our colleagues. And genuinely, my prevailing sort of attitude is let people do the talking and try to take yourself out of it as much as possible.
Makes sense.
I would just,
yep, fine.
I would just add, yeah, I think I agree. Really, really open questions, or like no questions, is valuable. But I also think like asking really, or probing on really specific questions can also be valuable. Like, let's just look at this one moment in this user's life, bath time. Let's look at this, one specific friction point and study it and try to create change. I think both of those approaches can have value.
Great. And then the one kind of last question was, if you're kind of designing outside more traditionally technical fields, which I think probably means more sort of digital platforms, is such kind of like systematic kind of research can be a bit overwhelming. Like, how do you balance, I mean, I think it relates to what you were saying, Ashley, but just the amount of data that you can obtain, maybe if you're working on more kind of limited like resources, how do you deal with that, overall as a challenge? Does that make sense?
Are you asking me, or I feel like Rachel would be a really great person.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, randomized control trials are part of why we do so much work to lead up to those, is that they're incredibly expensive, right? Activating like hundreds of, tens of people on the ground to survey thousands of people is an incredible investment of money. So you have to be incredibly confident that like what you're doing is the right thing and is going to create impact. Some of the things that we do pretty regularly to just get quick qualitative data in a much less rigorous way is to use people's existing communication preferences and to reach out to our networks through, let's say, WhatsApp. So a colleague of mine, Shirley Rodriguez, is doing an amazing education project in Colombia right now, and she needed to understand or really test some of our assumptions about how much time for like a WhatsApp education program, how much time parents would be willing to sort of loan their phone to their kids per day, right? And this is really to test the assumption that like this is a viable thing to have parents share this incredibly valuable resource with their kids. So I think in a matter of days, she got 200 parents to respond using the IRC's existing sort of networks and using WhatsApp, which is one, the channel that we know this program would be delivered on, but also something that people sort of commonly have across many different types of phones. So I think being really scrappy, but really trying to connect with people on platforms in ways that they're already comfortable with.
Great. I've got a really good sort of kind of real life question here. And then I think after that, Leah, I'll get back to you. Okay. So do you ever run into challenges where stakeholders are trying to disguise qualitative research as quantitative because they feel it will boost credibility? For example, situations when someone tallies the percentage of participants performing a certain action or conducts a survey that primarily asks open-ended or qualitative questions. How do you handle these situations, and how do you explain where the line is between qualitative and quantitative research? Excellent question.
Hi, sorry for the child on my lap here. I think first of all, yeah, I think that for things like open-ended survey questions, I've heard people classify them as either qualitative or quantitative. I don't think it matters ultimately, but I would say that qualitative coding of open-ended responses is certainly systemic and is certainly something that can be measured and is rigorous. So I wouldn't assume that just because a participant is speaking in their own words, you're not able to systemically make decisions based around that.
Great. So Leah, back to you.
Awesome. So we have a couple of questions, like really looking into the future of design research and thinking how the field is changing a little bit. So our first question is, We know that in-person research is difficult at the moment. We're relying more and more on remote research tools. It has its benefits, right? We can reach more people, we can get to more geographies. What are different ways that we can continue to scale qualitative research? Ashley, I'll ask you that question.
Sure. This will kind of be like a very specific plug, but I think one thing that we're thinking about in my team is representation and inclusion in research. We now have all these remote tools. We can reach so many more people. Now we can push ourselves to like study more in line with the population and reach new groups of people that, you know, for example, our office is in New York, so all of our in-person research, or the majority of it, was with people who live in New York, you know. So now scale really means like, all right, now that we can reach anyone, like let's really be more rigorous. Let's look at new groups, which might take some more effort or some more operational support to really make those things happen.
How about for you, Rachel? If some of your population is not necessarily using digital tools, what are the ways that you're scaling research or continuing your research efforts, even when you might not be able to travel to some of the locations that you traditionally visited?
Yeah, it's such an important transformation we've made in our work that was problematic to begin with. So one of the things that we've been doing that's been led by designer Carla Lopez, a colleague of mine at Airbell, is to really strengthen our pipeline of amazing designers that are from or reside in the context that we work in. So we're doing that. We're working with people like the Nairobi Design Institute, people who are really building capacity of designers in country. The second thing we do, though, that's, you know, honestly, it's shameful that we didn't come to this earlier, and certain other parts of the organization have definitely done this, but we have offices in almost 30 different countries all over the world. And these are people who have an enormous array of different capabilities, different skill sets. And so frequently what we're doing, and again, this is sort of the picture I showed at the beginning, is thinking about sort of proximal or sort of analogous skill sets to someone who can do amazing design research. People who have the knowledge base, who are closest to those we seek to impact, and really working with them to understand, yes, should we continue with traditional design research methods, and what do we need to do to make sure that like you're gonna crush it? Or like, what are other ways that we can learn that you are incredibly well suited for? So I think we're really looking to take ourselves out and think about it as more of a coordinator or management role, and really seek to understand, like, one, how we can work with amazing designers in the places that our programs are actually being implemented, but also like, how can we empower is not the right word, but how can we collaborate and learn with the people who are already doing the amazing work at the IRC and are actually implementers of some of the programs that we're hoping to support or improve or build new versions of.
And Juliet, for you, what are some of the ways that you think that we can continue scaling qualitative research?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited about the ways in which we're doing remote research, and I've seen such a big change even over the last 5 years. And as Ashley was saying, it helps us really expand who we talk to, right? I mean, making sure that we have research participants who are much more representative of, you know, the overall population than who we could get, who's available in Midtown Manhattan during the day, right? So, you know, one tool that we use a lot is called DScout, and I think probably a lot of researchers here have used it, but it's a really, really nice platform to be able to move between smaller and larger scales of respondents based on how much depth you want to go into with them. So for example, we might launch a DScout study with 60 or 80 people, which is this really funny spot. It's like, for our purposes here, like kind of neither qual or quant, but you're able to get some directionality out of that. And then do a recruit from that for doing in-depth interviews, you know, and then you're able to potentially find something in your in-depth interview that you then bring back to the larger group. So being able to move between sizes of a conversation essentially is really nice. And you can both use, I have a few million people in their panel, or sometimes we bring in our own folks. So so that's an example of a tool that I think is adapting really well for the times. And I feel like I'm like selling them, but it was built by researchers, and you can tell it has a lot of the affordances that matter to us. So give it a shot.
Awesome. Juliet, and you do bring an interesting point where the more that we're scaling qualitative research, sometimes that means that we end up with more data that we're synthesizing. So I wonder if, like, as we're thinking of scaling qualitative research, are there any emerging technologies or tools that you're using to help with how you synthesize the findings from qual as we're reaching more audiences?
I can see things which are coming, which aren't quite here yet from a sort of mainstream point of view, and that would be like sentiment analysis, for example. I think a lot of the analysis of social media, for example, even can kind of fall into that realm. So it's almost like we're almost there, but still we work with people who do qualitative coding and can code a couple thousand responses, right? So I feel like we're in the sort of brackish zone between moving from a very hands-on way of analyzing a lot of qualitative information to something which becomes much more machine driven. And I feel like we're just not quite yet there, but I can see it. You can see it coming.
Yeah. Ashley, how about for you, anything that you're using that's changing how you synthesize learnings from research?
I feel like I'm also about to do a sales pitch for Reduct, which is this tool I use, but I agree, as we scale research, do larger studies with still trying to preserve that depth, like it's more work on the back end. So I think, having ways to quickly code, for themes and to pull together a compelling story, that's where I see the tools going. So, I mentioned reduct.io, I think it is. It's a tool where you upload a video, it transcribes and helps you like quickly get to themes and then pull together reels and quotes in order to build a compelling story. And I found that like it sped up my process, 10x. And so I love any tool that like helps me still be an expert, still bring my expertise to the table, but just to make my process faster to compete with, the behavioral data that can be pulled in an hour.
Great. So we're talking
I just want to build on that in general, because I think that machine translation of transcripts is something which is here now and is amazing, right? And to Ashley's point, like this is integrating into tools, and there are standalone things which do this as well. And I think that has just opened up a lot of space to be able to work really quickly with transcript data. So do that as a way to start.
Rachel, anything you'd like to add to that combo?
I mean, the ability to open collaboration up by using Google Translate, like live Google Translate, has been amazing for me. We do a lot of work in Latin America now, and I'm on conference calls with like different ministries and holding my phone up to the speaker, and it will like give me a transcript of the conversation. It's sort of mind-blowing, but thinking about the opportunity again to sort of just like distribute the general sort of designer researcher as this sort of central figure who disseminates insights, but rather allowing you to engage with people who are actually much closer to the problem, and specifically with our context. So yes, to like immediate transcripts, it's really not in the sort of research realm, but in just the collaboration realm has been a huge change in our ability to collaborate with a lot of different contexts.
So we've talked a lot about the benefits of remote research, reaching more geographies, or sometimes coaching people in the ground to conduct the research. But post-COVID, like when would we need to go back and do in-person research? What would justify the cost of like traveling to the different locations or bringing people to us?
You know, I think that when you're looking for behavior that people might not even be aware of. So for example, we did a study last year with people as they were cooking, right? We wanted to understand how are people actually using their mobile phones when they cook, and how many times do you move between, you know, ingredients and steps, you know, and that kind of thing would be very hard for someone to articulate. And they're not able to really do that out of context because it's sort of so, I don't know, like instantly reactive. So yeah, so I'd say that places where you wouldn't be able to get to some level of nuance that you'd be able to get if you were in the space with them. But I think at this point, you have to have a reason why you want to do in-person research versus that being the norm, even going forward post whatever this is.
I would just add, I think if we think about like the psychology of being in digital space, it's so performative. You know, it's about putting on a good face. I was actually in an interview earlier today, and one of the participants said, "Oh, I got that wrong. Like, you know, I'm sorry, what's the right answer?" Right? It just adds to the performative nature of us as human beings. And so I think in person, there's this opportunity to connect, to relax, to like spend more time, and to really have those deeper observations that you wouldn't get, you know, on a Hangouts.
Great. All right, so I'll move us to the last question from our end before we open it back up to the questions from the audience. So this is more of like, where do you guys see qualitative research going in the next 5 years? Rachel, we'll start with you.
So generally we use design research, qualitative research in early stages of the project to sort of surface opportunities and you know, find inspiration, really sort of generative piece. I think our work is moving to be faster and to look at how we can more effectively leverage existing evidence. So in the fields of poverty alleviation, maternal and newborn health, sexual reproductive health, you know, distance learning. So these are solutions that may exist in other parts of the world. So a lot of our work is moving straight to, what does it look like if you take this solution and you immediately start testing it, or you start prototyping something immediately, or you take a research paper that you've read where this has impact and you modify it for this particular context. So for us, it's, I think, moving to be qualitative research that's more about evaluating how something that already exists in a different context works in a new place. So for us, aside from all the sort of processes and kind of teams we're doing, and really looking at this research process in a more distributed way, I think it's about us testing things earlier and faster. And it, you know, I don't think that's relevant for everyone, but particularly in the places we work, it seems like a missed opportunity to ignore the amazing amount of solutions and work that's being in other parts of the world.
Great. How about for you, Ashley? Where do you see qualitative research going in the next 5 years?
And I think we're increasingly seeing that being a qualitative practitioner, especially in tech, is like not enough. And so I think we're increasingly seeing like mixed method roles, which I think are really important. And so, you know, you're now a researcher that can do interviews and surveys, but you can also like use SQL and do like statistical coding and things like that. So I think for better or worse, that seems like where the industry is heading. And I think there's value in it because, right, you as a mixed methods researcher, you don't have to rely on someone else in order to tell a full story or to bring both of those perspectives. And your brain is also, right, like bringing both of those perspectives together. From from a more balanced place. So I think there's value in it, but I also think there's value in just focusing on the qual.
And we'll wrap that up with Juliet before I hand it back to Richard.
Yeah, I think like Ashley, seeing an expansion of skill sets to be able to, I love your point about like not having to rely on someone else, like being able to do all of the insight generation as you know, as one person is really valuable. And I've seen more people coming into research from more statistical areas where we used to see people coming in more from like anthropology and sociology. So I think that that's kind of interesting too, just like what fields tend to feed into research.
So we have a few more questions from the audience, and Richard will ask those to the panelists.
Great. Great. I'll start with this one. So I think, again, we kind of touched on this, but how do you balance building or researching for everyone versus for someone specific? And how do you communicate this to like stakeholders? So I think you, Juliet, you were talking a bit about, you know, observation in the kitchen and stuff like that. But I wonder, there is a lot of power in observing someone's specifics need, especially when that person is maybe an extreme user. You know, how do you balance that type of work, and then how do you communicate it out?
So is the question more about like designing for one stakeholder versus designing for a group of stakeholders? Is that kind of what the question is getting at, or is it about like?
I think it's
am I hearing
about
that right?
designing, thinking about a specific person when you're kind of designing and sort of getting inspired.
Oh, got it.
Or
Yeah.
trying to build for everyone in the population.
Got it. Well, you know, one example that I use, that I don't even know if it's that effective, but I say, if you're trying to design for everybody, you end up with the Super Bowl halftime show, right? And it's like, nobody loves it, but they're trying to like throw in something for everybody, and it ends up as just this mess that has no point of view. So yeah, I think it is helpful to design for some, like have someone in mind. And that's where, again, I think mixed methods can be helpful, because if you have someone in mind and you know them through some qualitative fashion, but you also know that they meet behavioral attitudinal criteria that would put them into a segment from a quantitative context, you can have a little bit more confidence that that is someone you want to design for. And to your point about them being an extreme user or not, you'd be able to know that up front. And I personally find that designing with an individual in mind is better for empathy and for idea generation than like a persona, which people tend to get a little eye rolly at. So yeah, I think that as long as it's the right person, you can design for that one person, but you have to be very strategic about who that person is.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's almost this sort of dangerous place in the middle, right, where you come out of a specific person, but you create something that's a bit general, but it's not quite at a quant level, and that kind of can be a.
Exactly. You have to be really aware of what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone else have any thoughts on that one? Okay, I'll keep going to the next question. So next one is, how do you manage contradictory findings from qual and quant?
For better or worse, when we generally use quantitative research is in this impact measurement, it's a bigger investment of people's time and money. And so people trust those results. What you can frequently do, so regardless of like all the design research you did, all the prototyping and piloting, people will still, and people will tell you, yes, I appreciate this. This is great. I'm going to use this. If it doesn't actually result in this behavioral change or attitudinal shift you thought you were going to see, it's gone, right? It's scrapped. Generally, what people will do is they'll say, well, the research wasn't designed right, or it wasn't with enough people. So I think there's certainly ways you can backtrack on what feels like the truth that comes out of quantitative data. So as we've seen with the election results, there are definitely ways to dispute what looks like solid numbers. But I think generally in my field, people trust and believe that like quantitative data, although there's definitely some sort of wiggle room if you're like, let's test that again. But yeah, it definitely holds the sort of like beacon of truth in a way that qualitative data, particularly when you're a Westerner coming into some of these contexts and you're like, tell me how much you love the thing I just showed you, you know, is a lot more dubious.
This is also this question, I think, Rachel, is more for you, so I might kind of keep on going now. But before you conduct interviews with people from a different culture that you're not familiar with, do you research that culture beforehand? And if so, how do you avoid gathering information that may stereotype people? And I think it's probably a broader question, just about can some of the foundational research you gather that secondary bias you sort of when you go into the field?
You know, and this is my personal experience, so totally understand that there are a lot of different feelings about this. I think it is possible to be both open-minded and very educated about where you are doing research, the people you are doing research with, and the problems you are doing research on. So there, at one point in my sort of design training, there was this idea of like, be open-minded and naive about that. That frankly, in the kind of work we do now, feels incredibly inappropriate. And so I think you have to hold both those things in your mind of, I want to understand the existing challenges from everything I can read. I want to understand what potential solutions might be. And at the same time, I have to leave room for this person to tell me or my colleagues what is actually happening in their lives, or observing what is actually happening in their lives. So I think it's a big risk, but I think if you go into these situations knowing that that is a potential risk, it's lessened, and we try to take ourselves out of those situations right now, because, you know, I think it is very hard to, you know, be learning, be immersed in a new environment with new people, and to be able to not think everything is sort of amazing and worthy of follow-up questions, to sort of put it in a really sort of naive way. But that's definitely something we try to avoid at this point.
Ashley or Juliet, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, you know, I think that believing that it's possible to be objective, there's a lot of hubris behind that, right? I mean, it's assuming that there is a point of view which is correct and you have access to it. And I think that is so dangerous. And so, like, we all have biases and beliefs and cultures from which we originate. And I think it's so important to be aware of that, you know, and as you go in as a participant observer into these spaces, to know what you are bringing. And someone told me the other day, it's like, unless you're a Geiger counter, you are not objective, right? So yeah, just be very much aware of what you are bringing in.
Great. So I'm going to go to one more question. So I'm sure this is true, but have you been in a situation where you don't have access to the right users? And if yes, like, how did you approach the situation?
Can answer this. I think I know who asked that question. Hi,
Okay.
Andrea. Yeah, I think particularly in a business context where like customer relationships are highly protected, it can be really difficult to get to, you know, the actual person you're talking to. You need to talk to the actual person that is experiencing the thing that you're designing or researching. So I think, like, I've always just gone rogue, right? Like, in an appropriate fashion, like, that person that you're trying to reach is likely in a community. So go to that community. I think you can also do analogous research. right? Can you study someone who has a similar role or a similar life or a similar context to the person that you're trying to study and transfer insights? And then, in a business context, can you develop a relationship with like a salesperson? Can you develop a mechanism in the customer service experience in order to like reach and really tap into that population? Those are just some of the tactics that I've tried in the past that have seemed to work pretty well.
Yeah. Rachel or Juliet, any other tactics for accessing hard to get people?
No, just the sort of never ending shock on some of my research colleagues who, when you tell them like, oh, no one's gotten interviews for us today, and you're like, let's just go to the market and we'll do some intercepts, are just like, how have you recruited them? What's your sample size? And you're like, now we're just gonna go and ask people if they'll talk to us for 5 minutes. So I think very much echoing what Ashley said, it's like, you just understand what the differences are from who your target user is, and then keep that in mind as you're sort of asking them questions. And I think that's really where some of the some of the best inspiration comes from, is like, oh, you're slightly different and you're solving this problem in a different way. How can we learn from that? Or how could this population learn from that? So yeah, I think being incredibly flexible and scrappy, and Rogue, as Ashley put it, is definitely our method too.
Cool.
And I would add to that, one thing that I've done, if it's about finding a way into a community that you don't have ready access into, is what we call snowball recruiting, where you find one person and then you say, who trusts you, and then say, can you bring in 5 friends? And we'll all have a research session over dinner together, and then each of those can bring 5 friends, right? So you move through these like trusted networks of people who already know each other. And again, you have to put in all of your caveats about your sample, but I found that to be really effective. And a lot of times the reason that you don't have access to someone or to a community is around trust. And so understanding ways to establish and follow through on that trust, I think, is the key thing.
Great. So we are just about out of time. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to Ashley, Rachel, and Juliet for all your amazing insight. You guys have tons of really interesting experience, and it was really a pleasure to hear from you. Also, thank you to Leah for co-hosting. And I just wanted to quickly plug our next event, which is about ethics in design research. So we'll be really exploring that topic with a similar panel of different perspectives. It's going to be on Tuesday, December the 15th at the same time. So encourage everybody to sign up at the URL, which is at the bottom of the screen there. So that's it for today. Thank you again, everybody. Thank you to the audience for spending your precious time with us. And we'll see you all next time, hopefully. Thank you.